Thank you. Okay, Shayla.
Okay. So I'm just checking to see if anybody else has an echo or sound issues.
Yeah, there's an echo, Shayla. There is. I don't know if now it will be. Can you try again? Well, I think it's probably pretty standard.
Okay, is that better? Can anyone hear me now?
Oh, yeah, now it's great.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I also just wanted to thank Bruno for mentioning about that we're on the unceded territories. The reason why like this gesture to me is really important is it shows respect for the land and for the ancestors of the land and the descendants of the land. And so happy that we continue to try and make these gestures in hopes that it will bring some healing. So this first picture is of me when I worked at the Classical Chinese Garden. And during the time that I was Operations and Visitor Services Manager, my team had 101 nominations for the Vancouver Tourism Awards. And I was also a member of the Art Committee. So the Art Committee had independent curator Leticia Sanchez helped us organize our shows. And Susan Ma and Deborah Joe were also members of the Art Committee. So to give you an idea of a typical gallery calendar, usually they would do about 4 presentations in a year. And we did them almost every single month. It would switch up to a new artist. So it was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun as well. So in this picture, this is one of the festivals that we would do. So the garden still does these kind of festivals, and some of my best memories were from times like this. So if we go to the next slide, this was a very pretty photo, but it was a moment of absolute chaos at the garden. So this is the funny thing about the garden. So it's the weekend and there's a busted water valve. And this is not the kind of moment where I was going to take a selfie. Let's just say that. So absolute chaos, and we'll come back to this in a moment. We'll come back to this a little bit later. It was an interesting moment for sure. And the next slide. So today I'm going to talk to you about the garden and art as sanctuary. It used to be that sanctuary was a place, usually a sacred place such as a shrine or a church. And it meant so much, it was more like because people could use that as a haven if they were running from the law or if they were refugees, that it came to take on this other meaning of a safe place. So the garden is a literal physical sanctuary in that people who are secularly minded or people of all denominations are welcome there. And it is an interesting thing. I can't see everyone right now, but it would be interesting to get a sense as to how many people have been to the garden. But I'll speak just in case you haven't actually been there. I'll keep that in mind and give some descriptions, and we do have some photos coming up as well. But most of us, if you spend any amount of time there, you will get a peak moment, and it's either a learning experience or just one of those moments where time stands still. So today I'm going to tell you a bit more about my learning moment at the garden. We'll go to the next slide. So in the summer of 2013, I was the lucky one that got to help the garden host Inc. And that was with Andrea Nan and her dance troupe, Dreamwalker Dance. and Wayne Nan. So despite the spelling differences, they are family. And it was a Canada Council grant that helped us put this on. So we go to the next slide. Oh, I should just mention too, Wayne Nan, you may also know, he was an award-winning Canadian sculptor, painter, and ceramics artist, and was very beloved by many. So this is the garden in the summer. So imagine that we're all out and we're on what was called the feminine side of the garden, or the yin side of the garden. The garden is divided into two different kinds of areas. So there's a little courtyard to the right that you can't really see in this photo, but that is where the two dancers are. So imagine there's also two just behind that tree on the right, there is a waterfall. So you can hear a waterfall in the distance, and it is warm. There's a lovely warm breeze on your skin. And then we're just in this peaceful, this is the view that we have, but also in front of us, we can see these two dancers. And one is sharp as a whip. Her movements are super fast. She is like a warrior and very aggressive. And I'm just full of admiration for her. The second dancer is more, her movements flow like water, and they're more delicate and quieter. It's almost like, you know, those dandelion puffs you've seen, like with the little seeds, and when you blow on it, they just kind of like all float off into the air. She moved like that. So you may have guessed that what Andrea was doing was trying to represent yin and yang with the two dancers. So you may also know that yin and yang are not a binary description of genders, but this is more about qualities and energies. They are found in everything and in every person, depending, like at various times, because it's always changing. And the dancers were embodying these characteristics. So we go to the next slide. Imagine they're dancing through the garden, and then they got here. You'll see this is a square gate, and this is over the Jade Water Pavilion. And the Jade Water Pavilion is where the yin and yang energies mix. So it is half masculine, half feminine. And the two dancers, it's interesting because Yang, she becomes even more ferocious, almost like her breathing intensifies. Her movements are more aggressive, and she is like inches from Yin's face. And if you can imagine this other dancer, she's got this intensity just like that in front of her face, but she stays very calm, and she's almost submissive as she's just kind of going with the flow. But like like my attention is completely on this masculine type energy. And then all of a sudden what happens is Yin takes Yang in her arms, like an embrace, and just brings her into her chest and holds her. And Yang bows her head like a child. And it was at that moment that I was able to see the embodied power of Yin. So it's just so many times that we're drawn to more aggressive, the loudest person, that is seen as often as more dynamic. But the power of Yin, it can be even greater than the power of Yang at times. It can be greater than the warrior or the loud one, and it is a force of healing. So now we've got several sanctuaries. It's a nest of sanctuaries at the garden. We have the physical garden space. We have sanctuary through art, through dance expression. And then there is also sanctuary in a non-physical space which is feminine power. So sanctuary through feminine power. And again, I'm not talking about gender. Feminine power can be available to people of all kinds of genders. We'll go to the next slide. So this is the circular gate. That's the other side of the Jade Water Pavilion, and that's where the feminine energy comes through. So the circular. And a big part of this lesson is just even being aware of how much the overculture has underestimated the power of yin. So in thinking about persuasion or power and influence, Carnegie once said that you can't change someone's mind without their permission. And that's a very interesting thing to say, especially when we're talking about beliefs and belief systems, because sometimes the more that someone will hammer their belief system, the more that the other person will respond with becoming more entrenched. And it's like almost like, I could even describe that as a martyrdom. Like they just would see it as, no, I really need to hold on to this. So go to the next slide. This is the idea that power, especially with that second definition, is the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. So sometimes, yes, this very much is done in a CEO or warrior type way. But Marissa Orr, she's written a book called Lean Out, The Truth About Women, Power, and the Workplace. Says that it's possible to exert power in other ways. It's just the overculture tends to value a narrow type of power. Now, the garden was this safe and beautiful space for me, so that I was able to be vulnerable enough to learn about the value of feminine aspects. So in this case, sanctuary is more than safety. It is also an opportunity for deeper learning. And we'll go to the next slide. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own story as an artist and how I found sanctuary through art. So I was born into a fundamentalist Christian household, and it was a high control environment. And I'm attracted to many genders and am comfortable with the term bisexual. If we just go to the next slide and tell a little bit more about that. So this was me, this was my cat. And in my community at that time, it was a very serious sin to be bisexual. It meant losing all of your friends, in most cases, your family, in some cases, your work. So shunning was also extended to minors, and a young person questioning their community is risking their ability to survive. Let's go to the next slide. It is literally a matter of life and death. Now, I was very ambitious and was able to still get along with this community and even do well and excel. Go to the next slide. But it took its toll, and it was very hard on my health. Even saying all that, though, you can't keep a cool cat down. So on to the next slide, there were areas where I found sanctuary. So sanctuary in this context is very important because my physical space was not safe. So I found sanctuary in books. And this is my favorite book from when I was 3 years old, and I still have it. And the reason I'm sharing this particular page is because if there's anyone on the call that's familiar with Asian art, you're going to notice like different things that are common themes. So the way that the irises have been treated, the shape of the crane, the neck, the treatment of the various grasses and mosses and trees, it's all very classically inspired. If we go to the next slide. So Kanuku Craft, she has become one of the greatest fantasy artists in the United States. And she did have this classical training. She's been on the cover of Time magazine. She's does exquisite work. Now, if you take a look at, and she always has like a bit of magic in her work too. So that was also very appealing to me. If you take a look at the foam in that wave, and take a look at the little kind of the shapes at the edges. And now we go to the next slide to compare. Now take a look at Hokusai's The Great Wave, and you'll see that the little shapes at the foam of the water are similar. So it was good art, it was good illustration, and it was based on classical artists. So very nurturing for a young person, and that little book changed my life. So it led me to a fantasy world that, in a sense, fed my imagination, but also like was a safe place to kind of find art, discover art, and decide that I would be an artist. So going on to the next slide. To give you some idea with context, when I first started with art, I was mostly doing works that were, it was more about color, it was more about shape. And as I started to question my community, my art started to become very different from contemporary art or mainstream contemporary art. As at a certain period in time, it really fell out of favor to be dealing with symbolism, transcendence, healing, metaphysics, anything like that. And well, these artists on this page, and there's even one curator who specifically deals in topics like this, well, these artists are all making this kind of art more, we're seeing it again. The conversation is still very conservative, but I thought I would share some of their work with you. So this next slide, this is Leonora Carrington. Just get you a moment to take a look here. And the pieces that you're going to see in all of them, there is a lot of symbolism. And it may, if we go to the next one, this is Hilma F. Klint. And again, like it may not even be something that naturally, some people are stronger with this language than others. Right away, they get a sense as to what it means when they see symbolism. It speaks to them. A lot of people, it will speak to their subconscious, so they'll feel something, but they won't necessarily cognitively know what it is that they're experiencing. And part of the reason I think that this kind of fell from favor is because people weren't always able to agree on a certain symbol set or what the symbolism meant. But if you take a look, like if you're familiar with Hilma F. Klint's work, it is just so astounding. Isn't it worth a little bit of extra work to find out about her and her worldviews, and to maybe that helps you in understanding what was going on. So usually there's some kind of writing that can also help with understanding works like this. And we go on to the next piece. This is Remedios Varos. And the next piece. This is Saya Woolfalk. Now, she's a professor, but I think it's Chicago. I've forgotten the school just now. And the next piece. This is Shayla Fumai. A lot of her work was performance, so we don't even necessarily have copies of all of the performances. Next piece. This is Deanna Musgrave, and I've added her in as she's also she's from my hometown and is exhibited in the really large art gallery there, has done very well with topics of transcendence, and is well received in the community. And next. And this is Reena Banerjee. As you can see, again, more symbolism. And next, Rithika Merchant. Again, like all of these artists are doing very well with their careers. This next one is another favorite. Tim Whitten. This is an actual skull with real gold on it. And the next piece, Zachary Logan. So on the left, this is called The Green Man. And on the right, this is a series, it's called Creatures. It's from his Creatures series. So here's a secret. The hummingbirds, this painting is not about literal hummingbirds. And we'll go on to the next one. So unintentionally, symbolism ended up in my work, and spiritual elements too, because that's what I was thinking about on a deep level. And I was limited in what I could actually say. I was questioning my spirituality, I was questioning my sexuality, and the subconscious needed to work it out. So there are different ways that we can do that that are particularly useful. Dance, mark making, painting, art making, music, dreams, all of these things help bring out like our hidden messages. And I found a sanctuary, and the way I traveled to it was through art. We go to the next slide. So this piece was published in The Pulse of Mixed Media. So that was back when the internet was still considered a fairly new thing for artists to be sharing their art online. So it was supposed to be a pulse as to what was happening online, as though that wasn't an infinite space. And at that time, it wasn't. So this is Rebirth of Light. And in the beginning, a lot of my paintings were really dark, even darker than this one. A lot of them, they were just like these tiny little caves of light with just like a few little sparks in them. We'll go to the next one. So this is more that rounded shape again. Yes. And what happened too is during this time, I was in Moncton, which is a French community, and they have a French university and a really well-established group of artists. And go to the next slide. So these artists would all meet about once a month and would get together for a wine and a meal, and then whoever had a show on, they would talk about their show. They were invited to speak to us about it, and it led to these great discussions, and usually there was a question period at the end. So it was very generative, and we all supported each other's openings, and the older artists kind of viewed it as their part of their job to mentor the younger artists. So again, not everybody was inclined to that, but there were definitely some very special people that helped me a lot in my development. And on to the next slide. And through that time, I was exhibiting a lot. So I had a lot of art openings. And what would happen that was interesting was people would approach after and would ask questions. And usually it would start with something like, what do the three dots mean? And it was through our conversations that I was able to figure out more about what I was trying to say. Because how it felt just like an urge. It felt like feelings, and it felt like things I was not able to put into words. Because again, that voice had been taken away. These were things I was not supposed to say or allowed to think. And when I was speaking with these other people, again, like in the Francophone artist community, it's the spiritual topics are not taboo. They're still very much unpacking their relationship with the Catholic Church. So we were able to connect and kind of work through some of those feelings together. And if you can go to the next slide. This was, I would even say this is one of my favorite things about art. Like, it feels really good to be in your studio. It feels really good, the tactile feeling of putting paint on canvas, or to be sculpting something with your hands, like the squishiness of clay. That feels really good also to zone out and just be in this quiet, magical time where everything flows. But the level of connection of when somebody they understand what you mean through your art or what you're expressing, they understand you and you connect in a deeper way. That is, it's a high for sure, like a natural high. Now, if we go to the next one, there was one artist in particular that meant a lot to me. So her name was Elaine Amiot, and Elaine, the way I found Elaine was, first of all, you would always know what was going on as far as the various exhibits were in town, and there were just, you would never miss the exhibits. So I saw her work, but it wasn't until I was in this best little bookstore ever. It actually reminds me, if you're in Vancouver, of a lot of like Massey Books. But it was the Owl Bookstore in Moncton, and it had used books and it had art all over the walls, and it was just this great place to spend time in. And she had this one piece up on the wall. I'm sorry, I meant to put in one of her pieces, and it just kind of ran out of time. But Elaine did like a lot of work with like strong goddess type women, and you wouldn't even call it that, because it just looked like so powerful that it wasn't a fluffy new age kind of feel to it. It was raw. She had been a cancer survivor, and she made that series after recovering from cancer. So she was showing like just the enormous strength and glow of health coming back and life affirming work. So this is the piece that she chose of mine, and she had in her collection. And what we had in common was that I also had a lot of health problems, and it was at this point where I was recovering, and I was going through a time in my life where I was healthy and energetic again. And it was just like this, what was on my mind was this feeling of celebration and this joy of the energy of life. And so it made sense that Elaine was attracted to that piece. But I was telling you about, yes, please. Next slide. I was telling you about the piece that she had up in the shop. It was very religious overtones or themes, but at that time, I would have seen it as transgressive. And the thing was, that didn't stop me at all. first of all, it's art. It's speaking at these volumes, like for me, that are 10 times louder than what anybody could say with speech. And I didn't know why it drew me in so much or why I was so compelled. But after that, I had to get to know Elaine better. And I insisted on getting to know her. And eventually she agreed. And we ended up being good friends, and I really miss her. So an interesting thing about Elaine, too, was that her experience was she had grown up in Quebec, Francophone family, but they were the only Francophone family in their village that was Protestant. And I don't think I can really explain how difficult that would be. But it was very difficult. So for that reason, also for the reason of having been a cancer survivor, and then for the reason of when she was a senior, she converted to Catholicism. Elaine's was very much interested in mystical, spiritual type themes. And in the Francophone artist community, as I mentioned, this was more acceptable, and the word mystic was not pejorative. And we go to the next slide. Mm-hmm. And Elaine was also bisexual. At that point in her life, she was married to Ed, her partner. So it was not necessarily something that was flamboyant or even known unless you knew her history. And at one point, she confronted me about being in a toxic community. And I'll just say, it was not, she was firm, but it was not an abusive exchange. And it left a seed, I guess you could say, which can be even more useful than loudly yelling at someone about their belief system. So this, like I said before, the instinct will be that they will likely just cling to it even stronger. So go to the next slide. So through the rest of these paintings, I'm just going to not so much talk about the story, but just show you a little bit more about the artwork and how it developed. So we'll go through these now, and I won't be speaking as much, but just, Bruno, if you want to take a few moments with each one. I always use a lot of gold. Gold has traditionally been used as to deal with transcendence. And there are a lot of volcanoes in my work. An interesting thing is, if you're from Vancouver, you might know Daria Akay. So one time I went to one of he's an artist, I went to one of his openings, and his mother was there, and she was doing tea leaf readings, coffee, Turkish coffee. And when she saw, she's never seen me or seen my work. We can go to the next slide. But she said, your life has been like a volcano. And of course, this was the series of volcanoes that I had done. And she says, but now it's going to be more like a crab with his shell always with him, with his home always with him, his sanctuary. And you will love it. So some deep women's wisdom there. And this piece also was, I can't remember now, but it was in a juried exhibit. Yeah. And this one has long been one of my favorites, just because it was like when the volcano kind of gets to the peak explosion and things are starting to clear out and you have more and more light coming in. And this one was finished in Vancouver. And next slide. So,
save recall.
Yeah, okay. So one of them didn't work, but that's okay. It kind of brings us around full circle. So now we're back to this picture of the garden. And where I'm going to bring all these things together was that it was through the garden and through my experience of growing up that I sought out sanctuary, but also saw the great benefits of sanctuary. So sometimes in times of crisis, the reaction is almost that we feel we need to be in constant stress. And 2020 has been a hard year for a lot of people. So one of the things that I learned from these experiences is that it is beneficial to seek out sanctuary. And it is beneficial sometimes to go into more of a yin state. So there can be wisdom there. One of the things about the garden that's pretty special and magical is, along with this beautiful ting at the top of the mountain, this structure or building on the top of the mountain, underneath that mountain, you can't necessarily see it, but there's this hidden cave. And the yin, the cave, is like sometimes in life we do have to go into a dark place and we have to think about things and we have to be quiet, or there's a deeper understanding we need to come to. And then we emerge. And neither of these things are wrong. Like yin is not wrong, yang is not wrong. We need both. And both can be for meaningful exchange, and both will show up differently for various people. But I'm also thinking that the kind of people that are on this call that are attracted to the garden, that they've also understand the value of quiet. It's not always the dynamic, like an American in Paris tap dancing across the screen. That is great, but it is not every moment. So that's basically what I wanted to share today.
So thank you very much. I will just go through once more the last few slides. I've been asked to go back for a few slides back, just to showcase your paintings once more, Shayla. I do have a few questions already. So if any of you has a question that like to pose, just please write it on the chat room or raise your hand with the Zoom option. Just once more. Hope it worked for everyone. I know we were having a few connection problems, so I'm so sorry for that. So the first question that I have here is from Leticia. I don't know if Leticia, you want to pose the question yourself to Shayla? Oh, okay. So Leticia has a question about if you could please tell us about your recent artworks as well as your personal inspiration when you paint.
Okay. That was one of the pictures that didn't make it in. So there was I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to, if you mean the recent paintings or the sculpture, because I'm currently working on a sculpture series. Okay, so I'll just go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how's your new work coming into life, and what is the inspiration behind it? And I wanted to show your second painting behind me.
Yes, so the painting behind you, that was in slide number 2.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
It's my collection.
Yeah, I'm really glad you have that one. That one's called Thin Red Line, and it was one of those times where, again, you just think that you're putting paint on canvas when there's more going on. So Thin Red Line is the song. It's about a battle, and it was where the troops were vastly outnumbered, and yet they were able to come through anyway. And it had to do with, again, like my health, in that I had been in a really, really bad state. I had been bedridden for 2 years, and I'm basically just, in bed all of the time. I hadn't made it outside of the house in 2 years. I was in bed the entire time, needed help to get out of bed. And so when I started with recovery, it was that feeling of it was a battle, but that I'd won despite thinking I wouldn't. And there used to be a red line going across the horizon. And later, years later, I painted over it. So you can barely see the red line. And visually it was a distraction, but like I always know it's there and you can see traces of it. So that's kind of also, by that point in my life, I'd had enough healing that it was barely there. You could barely see the signs of any illness. I was quite vibrant and healthy, and so that piece is a piece about healing. And I'm glad that you have that piece, Letitia.
Thank you.
Some of the new pieces that I'm working on, the thing about Vancouver is it's made me love the color gray. So a lot of the new things have to do with, and also that I think that I'm going to be doing some experiments with a little bit with the city lights, as I have this. Now, these aren't literal places, okay? Like these places, it's not a literal landscape, but land does have an impact just the same. This land is a symbol. So it's going to, again, I think that there might be a little bit, some urban influences in some of these newer pieces, more grays, more whites, and also more night pieces. So stars and moons. Again, it's just some more of the kind of spiritual place where I'm at right now. The other new work is sculptural in nature. I might be able to show you a piece, just a sec. Yeah. Okay, let's see. No, sorry guys, like
no,
it's not going to take good quality, but basically, again, it's inspired by symbolism, and it's sculpture. So the little pieces I was going to show you, there are very realistic flowers. So they're biologically correct, and they've got the veins on them and everything like that. So they're made out of a kind of porcelain, and these are going to be in shrines. And but I'm not just exploring spirituality, I'm also exploring other themes there. So and they're highly symbolic. So that's also where some of my new work is.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Leticia, and thank you, Shayla. Shayla, I have another question for you. What are the advantages and drawbacks of literal sanctuaries and symbolic sanctuaries?
That's a really good question. Advantages and drawbacks. Well, one of the things, say for example, fantasy literature has come under a lot of attack by parents who want to make sure that their children have a realistic basis on life, that they're not too prone to daydream, that they have a firm hold on reality, that they have the practical skills that they need to get through life. And it's possible if you stay, again, like staying in yin, and to always be in yin is not good either. So it's possible to, if you stay there, then you may miss out on life, or you may have very little touch with reality and the world going on around you. It's possible you may miss out on interactions with people. So it's a balancing act. And the important thing to know is that not all advice out there applies to us at a given moment. So there is so much advice going out there. And it could be like, oh, it's time for you to seize the day. It's time for you to like get it together. And it might be, or it might not be. What you need to do is have a really honest appraisal with yourself. And you're the only one that knows whether or not it's time to be in sanctuary or it's time to be out there.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question as well. I have a next question from Jerry. So the question is, does the proximity to Vancouver's mountains and ocean provide any source of inspiration?
Oh, how could it not? So this is, when I first moved to Vancouver, it was like, well, it was literally, it felt like a honeymoon, almost like falling in love with a person. So Vancouver is such a great city, and it feels really good. I'm steps away from English Bay, so I go down and I can feel like the waves coming in and listen to the waves coming in, and that gets you grounded. And it sometimes the city can be it can be like, even smaller cities can be an intense space. So it's like a cleansing aspect. And the mountains, the hikes, all of these things, it's more like they provide nourishment and nurturing. So I'm not generally painting actual places, but inspiration takes many forms, and it's more like filling yourself up and making sure that you're healthy, and that you have like it's a real blessing to be in an area like this.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Shayla, as well. So the next question I have is from Michael. Michael is asking that with such an emotional presentation, thank you very much, how emotional it is for you to paint while talking about your own experiences. Does sometimes it gets too much and you have to stop?
Yeah, I was worried I was going to cry when I was preparing for the talk, and I was really worried about that. I was telling a couple friends about it, and they said, well, that's kind of funny because that's also perhaps like a yin expression. And there was still shame about that. So I grew up in more of a macho household and was the oldest of two brothers. So my youth, I was a very fiery individual. And as as I'm going into middle age now, I'm finding more the reverse as sometimes dominant, and yet it's still an ongoing process of coming to peace with being in that phase of life, because there would still be shame in showing that much emotion, and it was not easy for me to talk about a lot of this and be open. I would say that a good amount of the time I have put out like more of a mask, trying to show what I think is supposed to go out there. So I really want to thank everyone here for being witness to another part of my journey and being able to find sanctuary and community with you.
Thank you. And you're welcome. You're a wonderful person and presenter. So thank you. Next question that I have here. Unfortunately, Claire had to leave in the middle of the talk, but I will still ask the question because she allows me to. So she's asking actually, how does the inspiration from your paintings, how do they come about, since they're mostly places that they don't exist? Do they come in dreams? Do they come in thoughts?
So that's such a good question. And I'm not sure if I'm ready to be so honest, but I'll try. How about I could say it's like a dream. So in the way that when you're asleep and you experience a dream, it feels real. Well, in a sense, these places also feel real to me. But I'm not really sure how to express that with more openness and vulnerability than unless it was a one-on-one conversation. So this is the kind of thing that we would talk about at an art opening, and that we would talk about one-on-one. And then we would get into these weird conversations that still seem somehow inappropriate in a public setting. And yeah, so I still have some reticence to talk about these things, but thank you. It shows that you're an interesting and special person to ask such a question.
Thank you very much. The next question that I have is, since you mostly paint nature and nature elements, have you ever thought about painting people as well?
My new series has people in every piece. They're all figurative. I'm using, but it's sculpture, so it's very different. Yes. And the people are taking on archetypical forms. So the people themselves are symbols.
Thank you very much. So next question. Do your paintings usually start with the 3 dots, or they start with a color base?
Oh, another good question. So they're actually, there are layer upon layer upon layer. So I usually begin with an impasto layer, and that's like an acrylic, and you put it on thick, like with a knife, almost like icing a cake. And then you can, like the piece behind me, I worked into it like even with bubble wrap, various knives, and that brings out the texture more and more. And then you start, so that part's done in acrylic because it dries fast. And then after, you put on like thin washes of oil, and the glazes build up gradually, and so that you get like more depth in the color, because it's this color field, it would be too flat if I didn't do that. So that's why it has all the many layers. And then usually the dots go last, but usually what comes next is I would start working on the trees start working on like a mountain or a volcano, like more of a landscape area. And then there's often like a darker cloud or a mist or some sort of a sky treatment that would come as well. And the dots last. Because you need to think about balance too. They're not always directly in the center. Sometimes they're a little bit off to the side.
Thank you. And I do have here one last question, again, from Michael. Michael's saying that as a young artist myself, I feel very inspired by your work. Do you ever feel pressure about what people expect you to do in your paintings, or you always do the paintings as your voice?
Yeah, definitely. I think artists will feel pressure to conform to a certain view. So that's a big reason why I was showing the other artists that are dealing with topics like this, is that it's such a big world out there that eventually you can find other people that are similarly minded. And it's okay to experiment with what people think you should be doing. You might find something there, but just I would suggest like keeping, if it's important to you, that's where the good stuff really is. And it's interesting because a lot of times there's art that comes, it's all logic. It's a series of analysis or a study of history that brings us to a certain conclusion, and that's very valid. There's also art that's very intuitive. So, Michael, wherever you kind of fit within that, if you keep giving space to have what really matters to you shown, you don't have to show it right away, but just keep making it. And then when you're ready, then share it. And if you're a big part of being ready is it won't matter so much what other people think. You will have made space for that work. And the exciting thing is there's likely someone else that needs that as well. As it's not just you that needs to put it out there, somebody needs to have it, to see it. And when you find them, that feels really incredible.
Okay, thank you. So at this point, we don't have any further questions. I'm going to start saying my goodbyes, but if there's any question popping into your mind, just please raise your hand or chat. I'll be happy to pose the question. So on the garden's behalf and on my behalf personally, I want to thank again Shayla and again every one of you who have registered and stayed with us. And I just want to wish you all an amazing day, and we'll see each other next week. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Bruno.
Bye-bye. See you soon.
Bye.